A Broken Geta Thong by Andi Brooks. What would be the consequence of a broken Geta Thong? Annoyance at the inconvenience? Embarrassment at finding yourself stranded in the street with only one Geta? The discomfort of a minor injury? A combination of all three? Would you believe murder and a revenge so terrible that the memory of it would haunt all those who witnessed the aftermath for the rest of their living days? Deep in her heart, the widow knew that she was being foolish for accepting the attentions of a man so much younger than herself, but she was flattered. Although her late husband, a prosperous rice broker, had left her well provided for, she had been lonely since his untimely death. She could not bear the thought of spending the rest of her life alone. The face reflected in the looking-glass was not unattractive, but the inevitable passage of time was slowly making its mark upon her once unblemished features. She was afraid of missing this chance of happiness. She had met her young suitor when the thong of one of her Geta had broken and caused her to stumble and fall in the street. He had rushed to her and, helping her back to her home, arranged for a doctor to tend to her twisted ankle. The young man visited her daily with kind words, small gifts, and in time, increasingly romantic poems. Her late husband, a kind but staid man, had been incapable of such displays of emotion. She was as taken as a young maiden by the attentiveness of this charming man, and did not hesitate to accept when he eventually asked for her hand in marriage. After their union, her new husband continued to pour his affections upon her, but little by little he began to spend more and more time away from home, dealing, he claimed, with important business matters. Whenever she asked about his business, however, he was always vague and evasive. Eventually, her suspicions became aroused. One evening, when he announced that business called him away from home again, she instructed her trusted servant to discreetly follow him. Upon his return, the servant reported to his mistress that her husband had passed the night in a notorious house in the pleasure quarter of the city. Heartbroken, she confronted her husband with the truth when he returned home. At the exposure of his deceit, he flew into a wild rage, took her by the throat, and with the ferocity of a savage beast, strangled her to death. Determined to lose neither his life nor his wife's fortune, the treacherous husband cunningly incriminated the servant, who was tried and executed for the murder. So practiced was the true murderer in the art of deception that he was able to play the role of the grieving husband with ease. Wasting no time in using his newfound wealth, he bought the contract of his favorite courtesan and installed her in his home in the guise of a new servant. But from the first night that they shared the matrimonial bed, the couple felt a strange presence in the house. The bedroom itself was inexplicably cold, despite summer not yet having run its full course. Mysterious noises were heard around the house, and objects appeared to move or disappear completely. Initially, they convinced themselves that a relative of the dead wife had hidden themselves in the house and was playing tricks upon them in revenge for losing out on an inheritance. They soon dismissed the idea when they began to feel unseen hands pulling their hair and pinching their skin at all hours of the day. By the end of the first week together in the house, their nerves were in shreds. The murderer received an ultimatum from his terrified lover. Either he found a new place for them to live immediately, or she would leave him. Half out of his wits himself, he needed no convincing. He promised that they would leave first thing in the morning. Had he known the cost of just one night's delay in quitting the accursed house, he would no doubt have immediately abandoned it. That very night, while in the throes of passion, the treacherous husband opened his eyes to find himself face to face not with his lover, but with his dead wife. In horror, he once again lunged for her throat and squeezed with all of his might. When he came back to his senses, he found his hands clamped tightly around the neck of his lifeless lover. Collecting himself, he buried her body under the house and reported to the magistrates that his new servant had run away after stealing precious family heirlooms. At the death of his lover, the unearthly presence appeared to leave the house. Thinking that it was perhaps a fair trade, the murderer decided to celebrate with a night of carousing and gambling. Returning home in the early hours of the morning, he was approached in the street by a distressed woman of the servant class. Her mistress, a lady of high rank, was in grave need of assistance. An intruder had broken into her mansion to steal an item of great value. She feared that the thief was still in the house. The servant begged him to come to the aid of her mistress. Flattered to be called upon to play the role of the hero, he allowed himself to be led along unfamiliar streets to an imposing mansion. The servant admitted him into a dimly lit room, in which sat a woman partly concealed by a screen. Before he could deliver the pompous speech he had composed in his head en route to the mansion, the servant placed a hand upon his shoulder. He turned to find himself staring into the lifeless eyes of his dead lover. Recoiling in horror, he turned back to the woman behind the screen, only to be confronted by his wife's decomposing face leering back at him. Several days later, the authorities, summoned by neighbors alarmed at the increasingly unpleasant odors emanating from his house, found the unfaithful husband with his neck snapped and a getter with a broken thong grotesquely wedged in his mouth.